17. Revolt into Style. Yeatsian Poetics. Yeats's notion that style might be an agent of redemption is canvassed in the opening two lyrics of his collected poems. Both the happy and sad shepherd tell the same sad story, but the former's glad heart ensures that it is finally given a melodious inflection, while the latter's gloom distorts the material to inarticulate moan. Le style, c'est l'homme. Content is again proven secondary, illustrative, pliable. Real joy derives less from right thinking than from achieved self-expression. Yeats has little to say and much to express, and what he expresses is the unimportance of ideas or content. Go gather by the humming sea some twisted echo-harboring shell, and to its lips thy story tell, and they thy comforters will be, recording in melodious guile thy fretful words a little while, till they shall, singing, fade in ruth, and die a pearly brotherhood. For words alone are certain good. Sing then, for this is also sooth. Art may soothe the pain it describes so well. To express an emotion may also be to purge oneself of it. If singing can be truth, then style itself may be the subject. Insofar as man pursues themes, he does not choose them, rather they choose him. There was a man whom sorrow named his friend. The danger of a world constructed on a foundation of pure style is self-enclosure, a point illustrated by the imperviousness of the dewdrops to the sad shepherd's overture. But not they heard, for they are always listening, the dewdrops, for the sound of their own dropping. Self-delight has its narcissistic limits, and so the attempt to communicate with a shell proves circular. Again, in The Indian on God, creativity seems to betoken self-enclosure, each person seeing God as a version of himself. Humans insist on seeing God as human, but Yeats knows that the soul may exist in many other forms. The parrot in The Indian to His Love rages at his own image in the enameled sea, fearing such self-enclosure, but seeking the anti-self. In the end, there is but one consolation. If pain can be transmuted into art and assuaged by it, then something has been achieved. Many of Yeats's early lyrics are written to a traditional air, as if the style preceded their content, or else they rework traditional themes and images as if redeemed by Yeatsian style. In this maneuver, Yeats seems to be hoping to add a little of his own art, just as folktale tellers do before relaunching the story back into the impersonality of tradition. Once again, the implication is that he is a sort of Homer, a name to which such texts may be in time appended. The poet, in seeking to dramatize himself, seems to become pure medium, the poetry evolving more at the instigation of words and rhythms than from the pressure of felt experience. The fear is that he may lose touch with the popular mood and learn to chant a tongue men do not know. Style is, nonetheless, prioritized, irresistible, a mode of action and power, as against the antithetical world of thought, contemplation, knowledge. Love is given to style because all dreams yearn to take their appropriate form, whether a man seeking a woman's or a god coveting the earthly. However, the fusion with that form is ever imperfect and incomplete, for if it were fully achieved, the passionate emotion would be expressed, and thereby lost. Many of Yeats's single-sentence breath poems deal, indeed, with expiration, the dying fall into the moment of death. Some attempt to conceptualize this method is offered in The Moods. Bodiless souls descend into forms, and these constitute the moods which impel actions in the world. But the style or mood determines the content of an action. This allows Yeats to respond to the Puritan charge of the bad faith implicit in mimesis, with the counterclaim that art creates, rather than describes, emotions and moods. Literature differs from explanatory or scientific writing in being wrought about a mood. Argument, theory, erudition, observation are merely what Blake calls little devils who fight for themselves, illusions of our visible passing life, who must be made to serve the moods, or we have no part in eternity. A style, like a mood, goes fishing for a subject in the unconscious, but once expressed in an embodied form, the subject, as in the Song of Wandering Aengus, may elude human control. The poet's attempt to recapture what he had created, a girl, a nation, is enacted by revision, by the attempt to see again and control all that floated free. But this proves impossible. The elevation of style over subject is possible only in that liminal, twilight world of wavering rhythms and half-said things, wherein the critical faculties are dulled, but not annihilated. In these moments, the all-too-present danger is sentimentality. The Cap and Bells is the fullest exploration in the early books of the process. It tells the story of a young queen who will only accept the jester's love, content, after first receiving quite separately its instruments, the cap and bells, form. Yet another case of expression becoming the very condition of conceptualization. The jester must lose his powers of creativity, his expressive instruments, before he can be sure of her love. The woman who enables art thus becomes also its enemy, and so the female who castrates is art. He wants the woman, but she wants the desire of the man. An irreconcilable conflict. Like all pornographers, she substitutes a part for the whole, his instruments for his soul. But, of course, he has already done the same to her, in fetishizing her foot and her hair. While in the pornographic mode, she holds his cap and bells in triumph, and sings while he is castrated. His prophecy is thereby fulfilled. I will send them to her and die. Self-castrated, he can experience ultimately in death. Only after this death can his soul blend with her body, and, at that moment, she also dies, reuniting with her beloved in song. In the hereafter alone are form and content perfectly at one. It would be possible to read the poem in many other ways. The male, as slave to an unacknowledged anima, being compelled to risk all for a full encounter. The Irish artist in England abandoning the court jester's self-castrating role for a more authentic national art. The high priest paid by the licensed fool for his plain speaking. But these are already obvious interpretations. The deeper life of the poem bespeaks a poet's ambivalence about his art and his subservience to image and symbol. Again and again, in early love poems, the poet encounters an exacting woman whose cruelty makes necessary the very art which she then proceeds to jeopardize. No wonder that he may wish the beloved dead in those moments when she is not killing him. A volume like The Wind Among the Reeds is deliberately organized around styles and moods, which later, taken in consort, yield up a meaning. For style is here a mode of arrangement. Never give all the heart might equally be read as a recommendation to throw energy into form rather than content. In other words, never to say it all in one poem, for if one does, then all is lost in the act of expression. The painter's brush consumes his dreams, will be one way of putting this. Our love letters wear out our love, another. The half-said thing is dearest, to lovers as well as to poets, since it still leaves them their role, and a passionate lover would, anyway, never wish to suspect that most of the passion was on the other side. Moreover, if one could seem to say it all in one poem, that could only be a dishonest appearance. Recall the actress, described in autobiographies, who could best mimic a feeling, only after it was all but gone. This raises the inevitable question about art as bad faith, but perhaps the notion of a false imitation of a true thing is more applicable to performers than to artists. The paradox in Never Give All the Heart is bitter, and that bitterness is rendered in the jagged syntax and awkward repetitions. On the one hand, there is the need to act, but on the other, there is the impossibility of acting out of deep feeling. The answer is the mask, a necessary fakery, which, if consciously and confessedly manipulated, is not vulnerable to the charge of bad faith. The Yeatsian, Wildean theory is uncompromising on this point. It is possible to fake a nation into existence via a style, and what is thus created need be no pale imitation, but a radical creation. The exemplar for the nation is not to be slavishly imitated, but one who awakens each man and woman to the hero in themselves, because all life has the same root. Hence the rigor brought to the discussion of style in Adam's Curse, the point being that what seems a nonchalant aristocratic mode is actually hard middle-class work. A line will take us hours, maybe, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. The poem is itself an example of the method, a conversation piece built out of the rhythms of an apparently effortless everyday speech. The styles of the outcast groups, of beggar and landless laborer, are recruited to redeem an altogether more sophisticated but threatened aristocratic wisdom by a writer who wishes to think like a wise man, but express himself like the common people. And the reward for such successful articulation is to be thought an idle trifler by the workaday bourgeoisie. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement, or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world. Yet a shaped singing style is not just a basis for self-conquest, but also an escape from the hot-faced bargainers and money changers. Indeed, the only answer to the question which its own success raises. In the end, Yeats will conclude that only the styles of the outcast classes can redeem the language of the nation. So, in the poem, he attacks the middle class, bitterly describing poetry in their terms of work, reward, trade. Even more, he attacks those, including himself, who succumb to the bourgeois disease of seeking for precedents in books, of imitating approved models rather than looking inside themselves. Of course, it is a functional irony that Adam's Curse adds to that tradition of learned love, in which all books become an endless rehearsal for something which never happens, agents of that delayed gratification, which is the essence of the Yeatsian life. That irony underpins many of the poems in the Seven Woods, which seem anxious to extirpate literary precedents from a tradition, but end up adding yet another. The rejection of literary models is based, in part, on the knowledge that sometimes even a style can go out of fashion, like an old song. The dire prophecy of the sad shepherd may be fulfilled. If Adam's Curse established the fundamental affinity between artists and women in their joint labor to be beautiful, the Masque echoes the idea in its call for a deliberate regulation of self-giving spontaneity. Masques, like assumed styles, are essential but problematic. They offer not the truth, but a way towards it. The poem suggests that women are seen as images more than as persons, and yet they must with labor maintain both of those aspects. The pretense involved in wearing masks may betoken a courtesy which hinders love, or it may make available the only viable form of expression. The tension between mask and face intrigues the man. However, the woman rightly refuses to remove the mask, for she senses that the truth lies at that unknown point where mask and face, anti-self and self, are one. Since style is the mask from which the whole person may be inferred, so the forms of an art may in time provide the synecdoche for a nation. This utopian idea explains Yeats's yearning for the success of the Dublin Municipal Gallery and for the return to it of the Lane collection of paintings. If the arts lie dreaming of what is to come, then the renovated content of a free island may emerge when least expected. And maybe I will take a trout, if but I do not seem to care. The terrifying difficulties attendant upon such a creation are traced in the Magi, whose lines reach forward only to fall back, and whose slow accretion of clauses conveys a rising sense of expectation reinforced by the thrice-repeated all, which is yet unfulfilled. even the opening word now is so qualified by the following phrase as to be annulled, and that technique of self-cancellation persists all through. Now, as at all times I can see in the mind's eye, in their stiff painted clothes, the pale unsatisfied ones appear and disappear in the blue depth of the sky, with all their ancient faces like rain-beaten stones, and all their helms of silver hovering side by side, and all their eyes still fixed, hoping to find once more, being by Calvary's turbulence unsatisfied, the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. The Magi is really an anticipatory style looking for an enabling content, a form without a finalizing substance, and this technique of anticlimax will be used with even greater subtlety in the elaborate stanzas of later poems like In Memory of Robert Gregory and Among Schoolchildren. An anticlimax is precisely what the Magi accuses Christianity of providing. The unsatisfactory incarnation of the divine in a fallen human body offers some hint of the sufferings implicit in submitting to a single form, and this comes the more appositely in a volume where Yeats deals, for the first time, with the chancy, sordid, reduced realities of an all-too-flawed Ireland. The assumption of form can be a severe experience of humiliation. The self-conquest of the stylist is won only out of an initial degradation. However, the poet, if he were to wait for knowledge, might never begin his quest, and so he must start with the search for a form. William Blake saw the body as satanic, but Christ took that form. Likewise, the artist-martyr takes on the weaknesses of the flawed medium which he chooses, before casting it off again. Incarnation and crucifixion are one, declared Yeats, by which he meant that style and form, pursued outside the self by a poet, are fully known as one only at the moment of death. By this logic, Synge could never have rested quiet in the tomb until he had found his anti-self on Arran. In Memory of Major Robert Gregory not only chronicles such exemplary moments in exemplary lives, it becomes also an instance of that enactment, eluding the artist's intended controls, as the deliberated poem gives way to the authentic one, the manifest to the latent content. The final stanza is an autocritical explanation of the seeming formlessness of the poem. I had thought, seeing how bitter is that wind that shakes the shutter, to have brought to mind all those that manhood tried, or childhood loved, or boyish intellect approved, with some appropriate commentary on each, until imagination brought a fitter welcome. But a thought of that late death took all my heart for speech. The very difficulty of enunciating that final line is part of its meaning. For now the poet too endures lack of breath, with his heart literally in his mouth, blocking utterance. Acknowledging its own redundancy, after a patently ludicrous attempt to tabulate and catalogue elements of a very casual build-up, the poem's baffled silence is in fact the greater tribute, rather like that offered at the end of The Fisherman, which concludes that the audience for, as well as the content of, a national art has yet to be inferred. In Yeats's middle period, the dancer becomes an emblem of pure form, sheer contour, devoid of intellectual content, opinion which is now subsumed by style. What Michael Robartes wishes to see is the supernatural element incarnated in bodily form, but the yearning for thought is not so easily denied. It's plain, the half-dead dragon was her thought, that every morning rose again, and dug its claws, and shrieked and fought. Could the impossible come to pass, she would have time to turn her eyes, her lover thought, upon the glass, and on the instant could grow wise. This represents a phase of womanhood with which the poet fully identifies himself by now, that moment when every rational control is lost and a supernatural visitation becomes possible. It is the moment of second coming and, indeed, the moment of Leda. The famous question which closes Leda and the Swan assumes that the price of full knowledge is indifference, and this is entirely in keeping with Yeats's long-standing conviction that to poets the half-said thing is most attractive. The point was, indeed, repeated at the end of Meditations in Time of Civil War, where the half-read wisdom of demonic images was to suffice the aging man as once the growing boy, though, of course, there is an element of resignation about the word suffice. While feminists have denounced the lyric as a glamorization of rape, it is possible to see that mythical rape as Yeats's metaphor for artistic creation, and the poet as identifying with the put-upon woman. As a mere medium for the awesome, impersonal power of supernatural forces, Yeats knew that he possessed massive gifts of technique, poetic power, but that his intellectual control over such language, analytic knowledge, lagged sadly behind. It is undeniable that his skill with words far outstripped his abilities as a thinker. His father had often joked, "You want to be a philosopher, Willie, and are only a poet." But the son was consistently aware of the dilemma. He refers to it in Vacillation. What, be a singer born and lack a theme? And again in The Circus Animal's Desertion. I sought a theme and sought for it in vain. He was being no more than honest when he wrote, "Those poets that in their writings are most wise own nothing but their own blind, stupefied hearts." The result is that many of Yeats's most memorable lines are striking without being lucid, like the end of The Second Coming, where the rough beast may be a divine agent of inspiration, heralding not only a new era, but also new subjects for poetry. This need not necessarily be a bad thing, for great poetry has often the capacity to communicate before it is fully understood. But that surrender of intellectual control did trouble Yeats, who sometimes felt more violated than illuminated by image and symbol. A pervasive theme through The Tower is the cost of worshipping images. The bird, in Sailing to Byzantium, achieves a highly qualified triumph, permanence being won only at the cost of mobility and growth. The image of Hanrahan, recalled by the poet in The Tower, threatens to unhinge his mind to such a degree that the poet must abort the sentence, crying out, "Enough!" He fears that, instead of mastering the image, it will master him, in much the same way that the images of Mary Hines in Raftery's poetry so inflamed Clare countrymen that they strayed into the bog of Clun. Often, when Yeats evokes an image, he feels threatened. This is especially true of the potent image of the swan, which among schoolchildren, causes him yet again to abandon a sentence with the cry, "Enough!" At these moments, he may feel unhinged, and even tempted to abort not just the sentence, but art itself, as in the third section of 1919. The swan has leapt into the desolate heaven. That image can bring wildness, bring a rage to end all things, to end what my laborious life imagined, even the half-imagined, the half-written page. The swan promises an experience bestial as well as divine, and threatens the abolition of art as well as portending inspiration. The poet, who has been seeking an impersonal style, must, like Leda, surrender to the indifferent poetic beak, being merely a passive agent of universal history. Until recently, critics debated why the fingers in the poem were vague as they pushed the feathered glory from loosening thighs. Was Yeats describing the blurred effect in a painting of the scene, or webbed feet, or was he implying some sort of consent with the word loosening? The violence of blow, so the argument ran, was mitigated by caressed, though words like caught, staggering, and helpless suggested no acceptance whatever. Most readers, noting the ambiguity in lines 7 and 8, ambiguous as to whether it is Leda or the swan feeling the strange heart beating, decided that consent, whether resigned or exacted, had been given at about that point. Perhaps the question asked simply whether the bird could put on her feeling with his knowledge, or perhaps it referred to Leda's experience of the strange, pulsating swan. It didn't seem to matter much in the end. There were even some highly traditionalist males who saw the poem's subject not as rape, but as seduction. All of this, however, misses the point that consent was assumed even before the start, by the swan with regard to Leda, and also by Yeats vis-à-vis the reader. The poet's technique of assumed intimacy, a polite phrase for a rape of readerly sensibility, is manifest in the emphatic opening, "a sudden blow." A Yeatsian poem seldom follows 19th century protocol in the sense of earning its terms or extending the traditional courtesies of literature to the reader. Rather, it tends to assume absolute consent and infeeling with its given world. Pythagoras planned it. But what? I have met them at close of day. But whom? So Leda becomes an emblem of the poet's violation by the muse, and also of the poem's assault upon the sensibilities of the reader. The trajectory of this lyric is in keeping with the strategies adopted in The Magi, The Second Coming, or the stanzas of Among Schoolchildren. A rising tide of rhetorical expectation over a slow accretion of clauses, leading to a final line that is somehow disappointing or downbeat, expressive of frustration and puzzled into question. This is a technique not only for bathos, all of life again being a preparation for something that may never happen, but for post-coital indifference. If consent, or at least resignation, has been the mood after the opening resistance by Leda, then this makes the final indifference of the swan almost tragic. The question in line 8 asked, apparently, whether the swan could combine the feeling of Leda with its own knowledge. The question at the end asks whether she put on his knowledge. In other words, had she foreknowledge of her story, of how she would bear Clytemnestra, who would kill Agamemnon after his return from the siege of Troy? If stanza 1 was centered on the swan, and stanza 2 queried Leda's response, then the rest of the poem centers on the puzzled poet with his final, rather voyeuristic query. As always, there seem to be 3 people involved in this affair. Though the bird is at all times brutish and threatening, there is something finally concessive about that closing, "let her drop," as if he were not in full control, perhaps even frightened by all this strangeness. At the most obvious level, the poem identifies the swan with the supernatural authority and power of the creative imagination, and so the broken wall and burning roof are less significant as historic facts than as immortal elements of a poet's epic narrative. Art and image are engendered there. At a deeper level, however, these references to one war remind us that Yeats was writing in the year of another, 1923, italicized at the foot of the sonnet. This leads to the possibility of interpreting the swan as the invading English occupier, and the girl as a ravished Ireland. The girl is more expert in feeling, the swan in knowledge. She is a mere mortal, whereas he comes from an imperial eternity. The debate about her alleged consent recalls vividly those common cliches to the effect that the Irish were colonizable because they secretly wished others to take command of their lives. The poem might then be read as a study of the calamitous effects of the original rape of Ireland and of the equally precipitate British withdrawal. The final question would then be asking, when the Irish took over power from the departing occupier, did they also assume the centuries-honed skills of self-government and control, or knowledge? The indifferent break might then be Yeats's judgment on the callous and irresponsible suddenness of an unplanned and ill-prepared British withdrawal. The Anglo side of Yeats, a man now in mortal peril himself during the Civil War, must have felt the precipitate nature of the withdrawal a hard betrayal, and a betrayal of possibly tragic dimensions, given that the two peoples had seemed in recent years to have come to a forced but real understanding, rather like the uneasy concord between woman and swan in the poem. The Irish side of Yeats was just plain angry, an anger palpable in the bitter, bleak monosyllables of the close. The poem was to have been about one kind of politics, the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, but Yeats explained in a commentary that the lyric which he eventually wrote was different. Bird and lady took possession of the scene, and he claimed that all politics went out of the poem. If politics went out, it returned again in the cited date and in the Civil War imagery. The poem which Yeats delivers in his moments of greatness is invariably not the one which he sets out to write, nor even the one which he often thinks he is writing in the early lines. Leda and the Swan may indeed be another account of the artistic or even the readerly process, but in teasing out those themes, it has much besides to say on the crisis of a newly independent people.